I've been wanting to learn how to use Blender, the 3D modeling software, for at least a decade. I did a lot of animation as a kid, specifically stop-motion animation, and I always wanted to take a stab at computer graphics, but I kept getting intimidated by Blender's user interface and just how deep the software is. A couple years ago, I started to see more and more game devs experimenting with a nostalgic early 3D video game aesthetic, like Lilith Walther's Bloodborne PSX, where she remade a huge portion of the PS3 video game Bloodborne to make it look as if it had come out in the late 90s, or the haunted PS1 demo disc Game Jam. And I started to see how maybe a simplified 3D style could be the key to helping me learn Blender and stay engaged as an absolute beginner. The final piece of the puzzle was stumbling upon Blue Maxima's Flashpoint, an archive that holds an absurd amount of old Flash games from the 2000s. I was playing through some nostalgic classics from my childhood, mostly from Lego.com, when I had the idea, well, what if I tried to do what Lilith Walther did with Bloodborne and take a slice of a childhood game and remake it in a low-fidelity 90s 3D animation? I gravitated towards this one Lego game that I played a lot as a kid, and I found a cutscene that could work as a fun, simple, straightforward project to finally get me into Blender. Boy howdy, was I wrong about how straightforward the process would be, but this time around, I was able to actually stick it out to the end. So, a little bit of context about the game I chose. Back in the 2000s, LEGO had this theme called Alpha Team. It was a secret agent spy series about a group of highly trained professionals, basically LEGO's answer to Mission Impossible. In this particular game called Into the Deep, we follow 3 secret agents as they attempt to save the world from a supervillain named Ogle, it's LEGO backwards, and his plan to control the world's oceans through mutating all of the sea creatures. The cutscene I selected is very simple. The 3 agents are in a little submarine, they're looking for their robot friend named TV before getting lured into a trap by the bad guy. Here's LEGO's original version.
TV's instruments will home in on Ogle's base. Let's check the sonar. Wait a minute, something's wrong.
Hey, where's TV?
I don't know. We've lost contact with him. Oh, it's an orb trap. Ogle must have re-engineered the orb so that they cause mutations. This must be how Ogle gets control over the poor unsuspecting sea creatures.
Well, they'll get control over us if we aren't careful. All right, we gotta disarm these orbs with Charge's orb kit before we can get to Ogle's cave and find TV. It is gonna take some expert piloting skills to get through this.
Pretty straightforward, right? So with the cutscene selected, all I had to do now was figure out the 3D animation pipeline. Easy. Because I already had the full scene to work with, I didn't need to come up with a script and could just focus on modeling my PlayStation 1 versions of the LEGO characters and then recreating the original shots in Blender. But before I even attempted to do any low-poly modeling, I went and I did the Blender Guru donut. My first donut turned out kind of melted somehow. Eventually, though, I was able to make a donut that didn't look half bad, but I found that the process didn't give me a lot of tools for how to make the kind of low-poly assets I needed for a PS1 N64 style. Luckily, though, I found this video by Steepstorf 3D, where she talked about having a very similar experience, struggling to learn Blender until she tried out low-poly modeling, and so I just followed along through the tutorials she recommended. Particular highlights include Sherilyn Lima's tutorials on low-poly modeling and rigging. Also, I'll link all of these in the description if any of them catch your fancy. So, armed with new knowledge, I started generating concept art for the characters and then turning those sketches into 3D models. Obviously, big question right out the gate, am I making 3D LEGO guys, or am I making humans based off of the LEGO minifigures? Ultimately, I decided that if I was going for a perfect dark, Metal Gear Solid kind of style, I think I'd want to do it with humans instead of LEGO characters, although there's still definitely a part of me that would love to make a rubbery LEGO Racers type animation someday. Now, the first challenge with designing human versions of these characters is that whatever system LEGO used for designing minifigures in the 90s and 2000s resulted in characters with a lot of similar base facial features. As you can see from the Alpha Team here, they all have similarly shaped eyes, especially. So with all that, I had to try and figure out how to translate and try and honor these character designs into human versions I could use in my animation. Ultimately, my goal wasn't to design the definitive versions of these characters, but instead to make the versions that would work best for me. And so the way I started on paper was with the eyes, trying to give each of them a distinct personality. I've only really been learning how to draw over the past 3 years, but after a couple attempts I had a few sketches that I actually liked and thought could work in a 3D style. So once I created full-body A-frame sketches, it was finally time to crack open Blender and start fleshing them out in 3D. I wanted to keep everything under 800 triangles because that seemed like an appropriate number compared to characters from the era. I also grabbed the models for Leon and Solid Snake from Models Resource and used those as references, which helped a lot throughout the process. It took a couple attempts to get Dash down to under 800 polys, but by the time I began working on Cam, I started really getting the knack for it. Again, thankfully, modeling in low poly is actually pretty simple, so within a week, I had the base meshes for all 3 characters ready to go for rigging. Giving the characters bones for animation seemed pretty straightforward. I gotta say, when I rigged them at the start, everything seemed to work out fine. It was only much later that I realized I had not weighted them properly, which created many problems for me. But we're not gonna worry about that right now. Instead, it was time to move on to texturing. Now, the flip side to the simplicity of low poly modeling is that all of the detail work gets transferred from the model to the textures. Take a look at the difference between Leon Kennedy's base mesh versus all the details you see on his skin. It's a very effective way of adding detail to a model while getting around all the technical rendering limitations of 90s PCs and the PS1 and N64. However, this would prove to be a real challenge, because I didn't have a drawing tablet, nor a good raster editor for 3D texturing.
At the start, all I had was a mouse and keyboard and PaintNet, which is sort of a beefed up Microsoft Paint with the ability to add layers. A good program on its own, but which really isn't designed for digital painting or more complex texture work.
So here was the workflow that I cobbled together for my first few textures. Okay, basically, I would sketch things out in PaintNet, export them as a PNG, import them into Blender, adjust the UVs, and then I would use Blender's blend tool to make the color blends I wanted, and then export that as a PNG, and then reopen it in PaintNet. But, as you might notice, all my layers are now gone, so now I have to start from scratch. I kind of did that back and forth until I had face and body textures that I liked. The first few attempts at the characters' faces were kind of scary, but eventually I was able to chisel out something that worked for me. And, critically, by the time I started Radia, I was able to actually get a digital tablet for cheap. I also, incredulously, discovered that I'd already purchased a copy of Clip Studio Paint a year before starting this project, and had just forgotten about it. It was there the whole time. I could have used it at any point. It would have worked just fine with a mouse and keyboard. Anyway, with that, the 3 main characters are done. I can pose them, I can move them around, and when I stand them next to Snake or Leon, they feel like they fit in, which is perfect. They'll still need some tinkering later down the road, but for right now, I'm really happy with them. I'd written up a list of all the assets that I would need, from the characters to the sets to everything in between, and so once I had the characters done, it was then on to making the first of the 2 sets, which would be the interior of the submarine. Just a quick tangent here on cheating in animation. In filmmaking, oftentimes filmmakers will cheat things in reality in order to make them look right on screen. Take, for example, this giant oversized ring in Lord of the Rings, or these very broken hands in Encanto. Limited resources or the particular needs of a given shot will create problems for filmmakers that they have to resolve, and open up opportunities for creative problem solving. It is a necessary part of filmmaking, game development, and animation. That being said, in the original 2002 Flash game, the very talented devs and artists cheated some of the sub-interior backgrounds in ways that made it absolutely baffling to try and translate into a 3D set, and I'll show you what I mean. Just right out the gate, these 2 backgrounds, entirely different dimensions. This background is way longer than the other one. Next, you can see that the central steering mount has a unique curved element on each side. That curved element is very identifiable in this background from Radia's console, and here again from a different angle, right? This is the right-hand computer console, and this is obviously the main steering boom in the center of the cockpit. So now, here's the background showing Cam's console on the other side of the cockpit. What's that shape on the left? It's the steering mount. They reused this background between these 2 shots. Listen, incredibly smart decision. Obviously, no one's going to notice when these shots are moving by very quickly, especially not, 7-year-olds, the intended audience for this game. Anyway, shout out to the original devs. You did fantastic work. I just wish you'd have, considered the possibility that some freak 20 years in the future would want to make a 3D version of this set, or whatever. Also, there's a roof. In this one, there's a roof, and in this one, there's not. Anyway, I condensed all of the different backgrounds as well as I could into a version of the set that I actually could project orthographically, and so this is what the modeled version looks like. I'm actually really happy with it. The wheel in the central steering mount moves, and I made Radia a little Atari-style joystick for her console to match with this shot. You may notice that in the Flash game, there is no door for them to be able to get out of the cockpit, so that's a fun little detail I emulated here as well. And so, with that out of the way, I started putting together the rest of the assets. I was kind of torn on how to adapt the sea creatures, because firstly, in the original Flash game, you don't really get a good close-up at most of these guys. And secondly, this is a dinosaur. This is a kind of bone creature. But then I remembered that LEGO had actually created little sea creatures, many of which were actually used in Alpha Team sets, and so I decided to directly adapt those models instead. I made a stingray and a shark using the LEGO pieces as guides, and then textured them based on nature photography. I realized in hindsight that they ended up looking less like mutated sea creatures and more just like normal sea creatures, but I'm still really happy with how they turned out. I also built an exterior model of the submarine, equipped with rigged arms and rotating turbines, and I got the whole model under 800 triangles, in no small part due to these very optimized arm segments that I am actually quite proud of. The last thing to build was the full environmental set. My first attempt at this was bad.
Because at this point, I still hadn't decided if I wanted to do a shot-for-shot remake or actually try and make a new sequence. After watching The Hunt for Red October and a bunch of Star Trek and 80s movies to try and immerse myself in media that would have influenced games for the next decade, I felt inspired enough that I could maybe take a stab at creating new shot direction on my own.
And because this scene goes from a sense of security to a sense of the characters feeling in danger, I wanted to try and communicate that with truly the simplest cinematic language I could. So the start of the sequence is a lot of close-ups to make the sub and characters feel very big, and then by the end of the sequence, the sub feels a lot smaller in frame.
Also, this shot right here is heavily inspired by this one shot from Lego Alpha Team stop-motion animation that I was a huge fan of when I was a kid.
With that all mapped out, I then followed these tutorials by the Sickly Wizard, which were incredibly helpful for actually putting the set together. And so, compared to my first attempt, the new version actually looks a lot better. Once the set was mostly done, I made some little stones and coral and these rigged seaweeds to scatter around the environment. And then all I had to do was figure out what the hell an orb trap was and how to build it, because you don't really get to see it in the cutscene before it immediately turns from an obscured sort of corridor to a super wide open space with some moving obstacles. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of this until I started thinking about other old LEGO games and remembered this short sequence in LEGO Star Wars where you're driving the pod racer through this cave trying to avoid obstacles, and this truly awful minigame from LEGO Island 2 where you're flying an airplane through a very narrow trench. And so I thought a claustrophobic rocky cave could actually work really well for the trap. And so, inspired by childhood school dioramas and this Dutch paper art where you stack papers on top of each other to create layers of depth, I basically made a little shoebox for the orb trap where these extra elements of cave depth just slide in to create the illusion of 3D parallax. And I'm really happy with it. The parallax textures especially really help sell the PS1 look. So, with all of the assets built, I can finally begin animation. I made a simple audio scratch track and timed it out to the storyboard after extracting the original files from Into the Deep, and then imported it into Blender and set up the shot lengths in the timeline. Within each shot length, I then started setting up the camera movements for each shot and placing each of the main assets to match their locations in the storyboard. This is the layout process. Here's where you can see I do some cheating. Setting things up in layout was a good way to gently ease me into Blender's animation processes. A bunch of things broke in truly bizarre ways, but eventually I was able to create a static and simple 3D translation of the new storyboard. After layout, I could actually begin blocking out the main poses for each shot, and then starting to do the full splined animation for each character in several passes. I ended up changing some of the camera positions during the blocking phase because I found positions that worked better, but once I was done blocking, I had to lock them in because adding additional frames to any shot in this timeline proved to be an absolute nightmare. This was also where all of the rigging issues I neglected came back to bite me. I don't know how it happened, but Radia's rig partially disconnected from her arm, meaning that anytime you tried to move it, her wrists broke in truly grotesque ways. Additionally, Dash and Radia's legs were broken. Cam's worked fine somehow, but the weight painting on these two did not work. This man has no ass, there's nothing I could do about it. At this point, I'm deep in animation production, and I just had to move on. Blessedly, because they're seated, you don't really notice it, although you can see this awkward jump in Radia's belt in this shot. I literally tried changing her model in edit and couldn't fix it. Life lesson learned. Next time I'll just make sure to more robustly stress test the rigs before I move on to layout. But after enough tries and dozens of hours fiddling around with the characters, I was actually able to animate them, along with the sub and the sea creatures moving around in each shot. I didn't realize until I finished, but I'd accidentally animated the stingrays like manta rays. Stingrays, as it turns out, don't flap their wings up and down. They instead oscillate them in this really cool kind of squiddy way. But I didn't do that. So apologies to all the Stingray fans in the audience. Once the animation was done, I began lighting effects and compositing. I really hoped I wouldn't have to touch Blender's compositor for this project because it scared me, but I did end up having to use it for the Undersea Mist Pass. I can't tell you why the Mist Pass works, by the way, and what settings make it so, but it does do what I wanted it to do, and so I didn't touch it after it was done. Also, just want to give a shout out to Drip's PSX Effects and their set of PS1 Blender plugins. It's $18 and it perfectly created all of the post-processing touches to help sell the PS1 look of this project, from the final screen resolution to creating the console's signature wobbly look. I added a particle system to generate bubbles for the sub's turbines, a couple systems for these schools of fish, and one more for the floating particulate you see in the water. I did this before the bubbles, so I didn't know how to have 2D particles always face the camera, and instead I had it generate gray cubes, which radically increased the render times for each frame, but I left it as is because it proved to be way harder to deal with than the bubbles. After creating new face textures for animating character dialogue and finalizing the overall color and lighting, I could happily export the frames and then begin work on the audio. I changed a few of the sound effects from the scratch pass, like the sonar beeping, but was ultimately pretty happy overall with the general audio noise levels, and so just did some minor mixing. For the music, I was torn between wanting to create new tracks and wanting to remix the originals, but after going through the flash files, I discovered there's only 14 seconds of music total, so instead I wrote some new music that uses similar pads and synths to try and pay homage to the originals. I really like this heartbeat kind of sound of the originals that I tried to emulate here, and I also took inspiration from the music of Metal Gear Solid, Perfect Dark, Metroid Fusion, as well as film and TV soundtracks of the same era. And so, with the audio done, I added it to the exported frames, and then finally letterboxed everything with extra spacing for the subtitles, which I aggressively pixelated to match the look from Metal Gear Solid. Thus, without further ado, after literally many months of working on this thing, I am very pleased to show you my 60-second 3D remake of this one cutscene from a 2002 LEGO Flash game. Enjoy.
TV's instruments will home in on Ogle's base. Let's check the sonar. Wait a minute, something's wrong.
Hey, where's TV?
I don't know. We've lost contact with him. Oh, it's an orb trap! Ogle must have re-engineered the orb so that they cause mutations. This must be how Ogle gets control over the poor unsuspecting sea creatures.
Well, they'll get control over us if we aren't careful. All right, we gotta disarm these orbs with Charge's orb kit before we can get to Ogle's cave and find TV. It is gonna take some expert piloting skills to get through this.
And there you have it. I know this is a very silly project, and ultimately it took way longer to put together than I expected, but I am so ridiculously proud of this. And now that it's done, I feel like it's opened a lot of doors for other animation and game projects I've been thinking about for a while. If any of this PS1 Blender stuff has provoked your interest, by the way, I've linked all of the main tutorials I followed in the description, and I'd also highly recommend checking out the no-clip documentary about Lilith Walther and Bloodborne PSX if you want a really great source of inspiration. I know I said 2 years ago I would try and make more videos at some point, so hopefully it won't be 2 more years before I make another one of these. I did release a piece of music earlier this year that I'm very proud of as well, and in the meantime I'm also working on some other music-y things in the background. Anyway, I'm very thankful to have this project done and to have been able to revisit a really fun, nostalgic game as a means of learning Blender, and I'm super excited to see what comes next. So thank you for watching.